Hello and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight, we're doing something a bit different in that we're not looking back at something that's already finished. We're looking forward. We're sitting with the anticipation of it. Dexter. Resurrection has been renewed for a second season. Production began in New York City in April 2026, and as of this video, cameras are rolling somewhere in Manhattan on a show that by all accounts nobody expected to work and that somehow genuinely did work. Season 1 gave us Dexter Morgan waking from a coma, traveling to New York to find his son, stumbling into a billionaire's secret society of serial killers, and ending with a kill that felt properly satisfying in a way the franchise hadn't managed in a long time. And now Season 2 is being made, and there is a lot to think about. So tonight, that's what we're going to do. Think about it, slowly, no particular rush. We'll walk through what Season 1 left open, the loose threads, the unanswered questions, the characters who walked away rather than got resolved. We'll talk about the confirmed casting for Season 2, which is genuinely exciting and which tells us quite a bit about where the show is heading. We'll spend time with the fan theories that have been circulating since the Season 1 finale, some of which are surprisingly well evidenced and some of which are a bit of a stretch but entertaining enough to discuss anyway. And we'll think about the larger shape of the franchise, where it's been, where it seems to be going, and what all of this means for a story that has now survived its own death more than once. There's no rush tonight, none of this is going anywhere. The subscribe button is down below if you want to stick around for future videos. Genuinely appreciated, but no pressure. But for now, get comfortable, settle in, and let's talk about America's favorite serial killer and whatever he's getting up to next. There's a version of events where Dexter, Resurrection doesn't exist. In that version, the original series ends on the 22nd of September, 2013, with Dexter driving his boat into a hurricane, faking his death, and reappearing later as a lumberjack in Oregon. And the fandom spends the next decade processing the disappointment of that. And eventually the franchise fades into the background like so many once great shows that ran slightly too long and ended slightly too badly. That version is entirely coherent. That version almost happened. Instead, we are here. And I think it's worth pausing on how improbable that is before we get into any theories about Season 2, because the fact that this franchise is producing some of its strongest viewership numbers in more than a decade tells you something genuinely surprising about how durable this character is. It's not just nostalgia carrying those numbers. People are watching Dexter, Resurrection, because they want to see what happens next, and that should not have been possible after the original finale. I want to be fair to the original ending because I think it's easy to oversimplify the criticism. The problem with Season 8 wasn't that it was incompetent, it was that it was emotionally incoherent. Dexter had been evolving, slowly and sometimes clumsily, towards something like genuine feeling, towards caring about his son, his sister, the people in his life, and the finale essentially reversed that. It had him choose self-preservation over his son, fake his death rather than face any kind of consequence, and end up alone in the woods somewhere, cutting timber. The character who had spent 8 seasons learning to connect with other people ended up completely disconnected. It felt like a betrayal of the actual arc, not just a weak episode, and honestly, the internet has never really let it go. So Dexter, New Blood had real work to do when it arrived in late 2021. And to its credit, it did most of it. Clyde Phillips, who had run the original series through its best seasons before departing, came back and essentially built the limited series around a single question. What does accountability look like for a man who has never faced any? The answer New Blood gave us was Harrison, Dexter's son, tracking him down to small-town Iron Lake, New York, learning the truth about his father and ultimately pulling the trigger. That ending worked. It was painful, and it felt earned, and more importantly, it felt final. Harrison had ended the cycle. Dexter was dead. Done. And then Dexter. Original Sin opened with adult Dexter providing the voiceover for a prequel series set in 1991. narrating in present tense, clearly and unmistakably alive. The collective reaction across the fan base was somewhere between obviously and of course they did. The mechanism for his survival turned out to be entirely mundane. He was found by emergency services, taken to a hospital, resuscitated, 10 weeks in a coma, and then he was up, which, look, he took a rifle bullet to the chest at close range, so the plausibility is doing some work. But in terms of television logic, it's actually one of the more restrained revival choices the franchise could have made. No magic, no unexplained resilience, just medicine. Someone found him in time. The show even gives the revival a chapter title that acknowledges what it's doing. The Resurrection premiere episode is called A Beating Heart. It's telling you exactly what it's about from the first frame. What Resurrection Season 1 did with that premise was more interesting than it had any right to be. Rather than reset Dexter to his Miami self or continue the Iron Lake chapter, the show sent him somewhere genuinely new. New York City is a different kind of environment for this character, crowded, anonymous, fast, with a criminal underworld that has no particular reason to care about events in Iron Lake or Miami. And the story it built there, with Peter Dinklage as a billionaire obsessive who'd constructed an entire social circle around his admiration for serial killers, was strange and dark and compelling in ways that felt fresh rather than recycled. I don't think anyone expected Season 1 to be that good. I certainly didn't. And that's precisely why Season 2 is worth getting genuinely excited about, not because the franchise has earned unconditional trust over the years, but because Season 1 earned it back. That's harder and more meaningful. Now, it's also worth acknowledging what the franchise was asking of its audience across this whole extended run. We're talking about a show that premiered in October 2006, ran for 8 seasons across 7 years, ended in a way that alienated a significant portion of its fan base, came back 9 years later for a limited series that did a lot of the emotional heavy lifting those original 8 seasons owed, and then launched a sequel to that limited series and a prequel to the original series essentially simultaneously. The sheer audacity of that calendar is something. And the fact that it worked, that audiences came back for each of these rather than simply deciding the original disappointment was enough, says something specific about what Dexter Morgan as a fictional character actually represents to the people who followed him. I've thought about this quite a bit. There are plenty of shows with protagonists people love who haven't generated this kind of enduring investment. Part of it is Michael C. Hall, who's one of those actors with the specific quality of making you believe completely in the internal life of the person he's playing. You always feel like there's more happening behind Dexter's eyes than the dialogue is surfacing, which is exactly the right effect for a character whose entire public presentation is a performance. But part of it is something in the premise itself. The man who cannot be what society requires of him, who has genuine desires for connection and belonging, who manages the gap between what he is and what he wants to be, through a system of rules that are both genuinely principled and genuinely self-serving. That's a character who doesn't exhaust himself. He keeps producing new dilemmas, new costs, new versions of the same fundamental tension as the circumstances around him change. Season 1 of Resurrection understood this. It didn't try to make Dexter relevant by giving him contemporary problems or updating his aesthetics. It put him in a new city with a new set of people and let the same fundamental tension produce new friction. That's all it had to do. And in Season 2, with a 4-year time jump and a richer relationship landscape, it has more friction material than ever. There's also something worth acknowledging about what it means that this franchise is still operating in New York rather than retreating to Miami. Miami is where Dexter Morgan was born as a character, where the original mythology was built, where everything that we associate with the show's aesthetic, the water, the heat, the particular shade of moral chaos that a city like that generates, was established. New blood moved him to the opposite extreme. Small, contained, cold, a single community rather than a sprawling city. Resurrection found the middle ground of sorts, a city as large as Miami, but entirely different in character, anonymous in a different way, with its own particular relationship to darkness and violence. New York is the right setting for the character at this point in his life. Miami was about a young man constructing and maintaining an elaborate performance. Iron Lake was about a middle-aged man attempting to shed it. New York is about an older man figuring out what remains when both the performance and the attempt to escape it have been stripped away. What's left, whether what's left is livable, that's the question. And New York, indifferent, vast, full of people who ask no questions and generate new stories faster than any single person can track, is the right place to ask it. It's a city that absorbs people, and the specific freedom of being absorbed, of being one of 8 million rather than the forensics analyst in a department of 40, is something the show has been using thoughtfully rather than just as set dressing. Now, before we get into theories about what's coming, it's worth spending some time on what Season 1 actually set up. Not a full recap, if you're here you've presumably watched it, but a selective walk through the threads that are almost certainly going to matter in Season 2. Because Season 1 was doing a lot of table setting alongside its main story, and some of what it planted was quiet enough that it's easy to forget it's there. One thing that stands out looking back at Season 1 as a foundation is how specifically it established New York as a city with its own moral ecosystem. Miami had its particular chaos, the heat, the vice, the specific social permission that warm weather seems to grant to certain kinds of behavior. Iron Lake had its isolation, its buried secrets, the way small communities fold violence into themselves and find ways to continue. New York in Resurrection has something different, anonymity at scale. A city where millions of people are deeply indifferent to one another in ways that are simultaneously freedom and loneliness. Dexter arriving there isn't just a change of setting, it's a change in the conditions under which he operates, and those conditions shaped everything that happened in Season 1 and will continue to shape Season 2. The first thing to note is the opening situation. Dexter wakes from his coma to find Harrison gone. No note, no forwarding address, just gone. And Dexter's response to that, rather than retreating into whatever anonymity he'd been maintaining since New Blood, is to follow him to New York City. There's something revealing about that choice. After everything, after Harrison literally shot him, Dexter's first instinct is still to find his son. Whatever that says about Dexter Morgan's emotional capacity, it says something. Something the show has been quietly working towards for a very long time. Harrison, it turns out, has taken a job as a bellhop at the Empire Hotel in Manhattan under his own name, which is either brave or reckless, depending on how charitable you're feeling. He's living his life right out in the open while his father's technically dead, while the events of Iron Lake are presumably still somewhere in the investigative pipeline. And early in the season, he kills a guest at the hotel. Ryan Foster, described as a sexual predator, dies at Harrison's hands in what appears to be an impulsive, unplanned act of violence. Not code, not ritual, just rage and momentum. That distinction matters enormously, and we'll come back to it in the Harrison section. But it establishes from the very beginning that his version of the Dark Passenger is a different animal from his father's. While all of this is happening, Dexter is investigating a serial killer who the New York media has, somewhat poetically, nicknamed the Dark Passenger. Ronald Red Schmidt, who targets rideshare drivers. Dexter tracks him, kills him, and in the process discovers an invitation in Red's belongings to what turns out to be a private dinner party hosted by a billionaire named Leon Prater, who has built his entire social life around his obsession with serial killers. Dexter attends as Red and finds himself in a room with some fairly remarkable company. The roster at Prater's dinner is worth going through because several of these threads are still unresolved heading into Season 2. Mia LaPierre, known online as Lady Vengeance and played by Kristen Ritter, kills men who have harmed women and had cultivated a following among people who romanticized what she was doing. Al Walker, or Rapunzel, Eric Stonestreet doing something genuinely unsettling with what reads as sheer ordinariness is a family man from the Midwest who collects the ponytails of his female victims. Then there's Lowell Sloan, the tattoo collector, played by Neil Patrick Harris, whose particular fixation I'll leave to your imagination. And the Gemini killer, Gareth, played by David Dasmalkian, who turned out to be twins, each unaware of the other's kills, which is a detail so brilliantly horrible that the show deserved more credit for it. Plus Charlie Brown, Prater's head of security, former special ops, played by Uma Thurman, who is not technically a club member, but who is fully aware of everything and has made her own peace with that awareness. Dexter moves through this group methodically over the course of the season. Lowell is dealt with first. Mia is framed for Ryan Foster's murder rather than killed. Dexter pins Harrison's hotel kill on her, which gets her arrested and, as we learn later, results in her apparent death in her prison cell, arranged by Charlie on Prater's behalf. The Gemini killer is resolved in its own way. Al Walker escapes, that last one matters, and we'll come back to it. The season's emotional center, though, is Angel. David Zayas, back as the character he's played since the original series, came to New York because he believed the Bay Harbor Butcher, the serial killer identity Dexter carried through multiple seasons with the late James Doakes posthumously framed for it, was still alive. He was right. He eventually found his way to Prater, and Prater killed him. That moment is the season's most significant loss, and we'll spend time on its implications later in this video. But the immediate effect is significant. It closes the last major original series investigative thread. Batista was the last character still actively pursuing the question of whether the Bay Harbor Butcher case was properly closed. With him gone, that pursuit should die with him. Should. The season concludes with Dexter killing Prater, retrieving his vault of files on serial killers across America, and arriving at a quiet kind of reckoning with himself. His internal monologue in the finale is one of the more honest the show has produced in years, acknowledging that his urges are evolving, that he was wrong to think he could live in isolation, that he needs people in the way that most people need people, even if his evenings are somewhat unconventional. And then, almost as a footnote, Detective Claudette Wallace discovers a file in Prater's vault on a dormant killer, a man named Donald Frompt, who operated under the name the New York Ripper. The camera lingers on it just long enough to confirm that this is where season 2 is going. There's also the matter of Charlie, who walks out of New York having reached a silent truce with Dexter, holding his secrets as he holds hers. And Al Walker, who has disappeared back to the Midwest with his file in Dexter's possession and his kills unfinished as far as Dexter's code is concerned. And Joey Quinn, who makes a brief appearance as a guest character, just enough to remind you he exists and that his relationship to this story has history. These are the threads season 2 is going to pull. Let's go through them. But before we do, I want to say something about season 1's texture that I think gets overlooked in the discussion of its plot mechanics. What made Prater work as an antagonist, and this is credit to Peter Dinklage as much as the writing, was that he genuinely didn't feel threatening in the conventional sense. He wasn't physically dangerous. He wasn't tactically cunning in the way Trinity was. He was wealthy and obsessive, and completely convinced that his admiration for killers was a form of connoisseurship rather than pathology. He collected murderers the way certain people collect art, with the same rationalization that proximity to genius excuses everything else. And the horror of him was precisely that confidence, the complete absence of doubt about whether what he was doing was acceptable. Blessing Kamara, the rideshare driver played by Ntare Guma and Bahom Wine, also deserves a mention here because his role in season 1 goes beyond plot function. He befriends Dexter and eventually becomes his landlord. Blessing is one of those supporting characters who functions as a kind of moral mirror, an ordinary person who has his own shadows, but nothing like Dexter's, who represents what genuine connection looks like when it isn't filtered through the code. Dexter's finale monologue was partly about realizing that Blessing and people like him are what he was missing in Iron Lake in his decade of attempting solitude. That thread presumably continues into Season 2, and Blessing's presence as a touchstone of ordinary human decency alongside everything Dexter is doing with the files and the killers is going to produce interesting friction. The Empire Hotel as a setting also deserves a mention. It's the kind of place where a certain stratum of New York society passes through, wealthy guests, a particular kind of anonymous transient luxury. And it positioned Harrison at the intersection of the city's money and its violence in a way that made Prater's eventual appearance feel organic rather than contrived. Harrison's bellhop job was never going to be just a job. In Dexter's world, positions of service and invisibility are always also positions of observation. Charlie Brown is probably the most discussed character to come out of Season 1, which I find genuinely interesting because she's not the villain. She's not the protagonist. She's the person in the middle, fully informed about both sides, morally flexible enough to operate in either direction, and arriving at Season 2 with more leverage over Dexter Morgan than anyone he's encountered since the early seasons of the original show. Let me back up a bit. To understand what Charlie might be in Season 2, you need to understand what she was in Season 1. She's an ex-special ops officer. Whatever she did in that capacity, and the show leaves most of it deliberately vague, in the way that good writing leaves certain things deliberately vague, it prepared her for a life in morally gray territory. She collected and vetted serial killers for Leon Prater. She managed his social calendar of murderers, his dinner parties, his obsessive documentation of violence. She arranged the apparent death of Mia LaPierre in prison. These are not the actions of a person who is squeamish about what the world actually is. She has looked at it clearly and made her choices within it. But her reasons for working for Prater are not ideological in the way his were. She was being blackmailed, essentially. Prater was funding the medical treatment of her ailing mother, and in exchange, Charlie stayed loyal and stayed employed. The moment she discovered that Prater had assembled a file on her too, that she was just another piece of documentation in his collection, another subject to be studied and potentially used, she left his employment. That detail matters enormously. Charlie's loyalty was always transactional, not devotional. She didn't love what Prater was doing. She was running a calculation, and when the calculation changed, she changed with it. By the end of Season 1, the truce between her and Dexter is one of the more carefully constructed dynamics the show has set up in years. They both know everything. He knows she arranged a murder and provided cover for a serial killer club. She knows he is the Bay Harbor butcher, that Harrison killed Ryan Foster, and that Dexter murdered Prater. Neither has any particular incentive to burn the other down. She doesn't want to go to prison. He doesn't want to be caught. And they both have more to gain from the silence than from the exposure. She drives out of New York with her mother. He watches her go. And then the Season 2 set photos started circulating. Uma Thurman and Michael C. Hall on an outdoor set in Manhattan at what appears to be a dinner table, appearing to hold hands, looking, by any reasonable reading of those images, like a couple, which is a genuinely surprising development, not because it's illogical, but because the Season 1 relationship was built on mutual threat rather than any apparent warmth. And whatever's brought them to a dinner table holding hands represents a significant change in dynamic over the 4 years between seasons. I want to be careful about reading too much into set photos because they can be misleading, and a moment between two characters doesn't always mean what it appears to mean in isolation. But the image is what it is, and it aligns with something that various critics and fan communities have been speculating about since the Season 1 finale. The idea that Charlie might become something like a genuine partner for Dexter, the first real one in years. Consider what Dexter's previous significant relationships actually involved. Rita didn't know the truth about him. Their entire relationship was built on a version of Dexter that wasn't real, however much genuine feeling eventually developed within it. Hannah knew and loved him partly because of what he was, but she was also a killer with no code of her own. And that fundamental incompatibility eventually made the relationship impossible to sustain in any stable way. Lumen knew, understood, and then healed from her trauma and left because the darkness that connected them was hers, to work through and move past. In every case, the relationship either depended on concealment or ended when the full picture became unavoidable. Charlie already has the full picture. She walked into this thing knowing exactly who Dexter Morgan is, and she's coming back anyway. The question of whether that's because she's decided he's useful, because she's decided she genuinely likes him, or because she's decided she wants to destroy him on her own terms is the central question of her Season 2 arc. There's a persuasive argument for the new Rita reading, the idea that Charlie represents the first possibility of a genuine, non-concealed relationship for Dexter, built on total honesty rather than carefully managed deception. The slow burn version rather than the immediate intensity of someone like Hannah. I find this reading persuasive not because the show always chooses the obvious path, but because Dexter's arc in Resurrection has been consistently about his evolving emotional capacity. He ended Season 1 explicitly saying he needs people. Following that acknowledgement with a relationship where concealment isn't even possible is the next logical step in that arc. The counter reading is equally valid, though. Charlie has real reasons to resent Dexter. He threatened to slit her throat in her car at one point. Prater, who was funding her mother's care, is dead partly because of Dexter's actions. She left New York under duress, not by choice. The woman who returns in Season 2 may be someone who has spent 4 years deciding what to do with what she knows. And the dinner table of the set photos may be a moment of deception rather than affection, which would be very Dexter. Here's what makes Charlie's return structurally significant regardless of where her arc goes. The Dexter franchise has spent almost its entire run disposing of antagonists at season's end and never revisiting them. Bringing Charlie back as a series regular is the show acknowledging that some relationships are worth developing over time, that not every character has to be a one-season arc. That's a creative choice that opens the franchise up in ways the original format didn't allow. Whatever Charlie is in Season 2, she represents a new kind of continuity. And there's a practical element to her return that's worth acknowledging beyond the theory. Charlie, as an ex-special ops officer who vetted and managed serial killers professionally, understands the criminal psychology landscape in a way that most of Dexter's previous allies haven't. Batista was a good cop. Harrison is learning. Harry's ghost is a framework. But Charlie has direct operational experience with exactly the kind of people Dexter hunts. She met them socially, she assessed them professionally, she knows how they think and what they hide and where they're most likely to make mistakes, because her entire job was identifying those vulnerabilities in order to protect Prater's investment in them. As an ally, that knowledge is invaluable. Dexter working through Prater's file vault is essentially working through a set of intelligence dossiers. Having someone alongside him who spent years inside that intelligence world, who knows the context behind the documentation, who can read between the lines of Prater's notes with a practitioner's eye, changes the quality of what Dexter can do with those files. It's the difference between having a map and having a map read by someone who's been to the terrain. That's the partner version of Charlie. The version where her return is about what she can contribute rather than what she might threaten. And it's not a naive version, it's grounded in her actual skills and in the specific value she would have to someone working through Prater's legacy. Whether the show goes there or goes somewhere more complicated remains to be seen. But the partnership reading is legitimate, and I'd argue it's underexplored in most of the current fan discussion. And separately, whatever Charlie did in Special Ops and whatever her relationship with violence was before Prater, she's a person who has spent the better part of her recent career managing people who hurt people. Being around that professionally changes you. Whether it changed her in ways that make her more similar to Dexter, more comfortable with the existence of violence as a fact of human life, or whether it produced the opposite reaction, a kind of exhaustion with the whole category, is something Season 2 will have to illuminate. The set photos of that dinner table are doing a lot of work suggesting warmth, but warmth after a truce built on mutual blackmail is not uncomplicated warmth. Dexter knows this better than anyone. One of the cleverest things Season 1 did, and it did it quietly, almost in passing, was plant the seed of the New York Ripper before we even knew who he was. The file in Prater's vault. Detective Wallace's reaction to it. The weight the camera gave to the moment, the slight pause before moving on. The show was effectively telling you, this is the next thing. Pay attention, and now we know who's playing him. It's Brian Cox, which is a casting choice that rewards a bit of thought. If you're primarily familiar with Cox through Succession, which is entirely understandable, because Logan Roy is one of the genuinely great television performances of the last 15 years, his casting as Don Frampt might initially seem like a continuation of that particular flavor of energy. Powerful, deliberate, psychologically commanding. But Cox has a much wider range than Logan Roy suggests, and the specific character of the New York Ripper is, I think, a very interesting fit for what he's actually capable of. Here's what we know about Don Frampt from Season 1 and the confirmed character descriptions for Season 2. He was at some point in his past an active serial killer who terrorized New York City. The moniker, the New York Ripper, implies a visceral, physical style of violence that earns a name like that. Disembowelment, according to what the show has suggested, which is not a method associated with subtlety or control. At some point, Frampt stopped, not because he was caught, not because he was stopped by outside force. He simply retired from active killing. And in his retirement, he found a different outlet, taunting the survivors of his earlier victims. The families of the dead, still trying to build their lives around the shape of what happened to them, now receiving contact from the man responsible. That pivot from killer to psychological tormentor is, I think, deliberately chosen. It suggests someone who has outgrown the need to act but who hasn't lost the desire to have an effect. The physical violence was never the actual point. It was the impact, the disruption, the power over other people's experience of reality. You can achieve that without killing anyone, if you're patient enough and if your victims are already sufficiently damaged. Don Frampt, sitting quietly somewhere in New York, making occasional calls to grieving families, getting exactly the response he wants from minimal risk. That's a different kind of threat than anything Dexter has faced before. It's almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. Brian Cox is extraordinary at playing men who understand power as something exercised from distance, without visible effort. Logan Roy didn't need to shout to terrify someone. He needed to not respond. The absence of engagement was the power move. That quality, the patient, deliberate imposition of psychological weight through apparent stillness, is exactly what Don Frampt sounds like from his description. A man who has transitioned from physical to psychological violence because the psychological version is cleaner and harder to prosecute. There's a casting resonance I can't entirely dismiss. Cox appeared in Zodiac, David Fincher's 2007 film about the still unsolved Zodiac killer, another case defined by taunting communication, by a killer's awareness of his own legend, by the sustained sadism of prolonged contact with investigators and victims. The Zodiac never stopped writing letters. Don Frampt apparently never stopped calling. Whether that parallel was in the casting director's mind or not, the thematic alignment is right there. The Trinity killer comparison is also worth making, since Trinity remains one of the franchise's greatest antagonists, and since both characters share certain surface qualities, older killers, apparently settled and respectable, hiding enormous darkness. But Arthur Mitchell in Season 4 was driven by compulsion. His ritual required completion. He couldn't stop because the pattern demanded it. Frampt sounds more like someone who chose to stop, which makes him, in a strange way, more unsettling. He has control. He knows exactly what he's doing and when. The active killing phase was one chapter. The torment phase is another. And he appears perfectly at ease in both. The Season 2 dynamic between Dexter hunting an older, psychologically sophisticated predator raises questions that the original series didn't often ask. The code requires confirmed guilt. Don Frampt is a retired killer currently committing no crimes that would obviously qualify for the table, unless you count sustained psychological torture of bereaved families as something the code can respond to, which is actually a meaningful question about the code's scope. It's possible that Season 2 puts Dexter in a situation where he has to think carefully about what the code was actually designed for and whether it covers this. Or it's possible that Frampt does something active enough that the decision becomes easy. Either way, the cat and mouse here is between an older, experienced Dexter and a figure who has had decades to perfect the art of creating suffering without exposure. Detective Wallace, meanwhile, has apparently been hunting the Ripper for years. That obsession is presumably going to put her in Frampt's orbit, and by extension in Dexter's, at exactly the moments when that's most dangerous. Season 1 had Wallace inching towards the truth about Harrison. Season 2 looks to be positioning her as a character who keeps finding herself at the intersection of her investigations and the secret she doesn't know she's sitting on. There's also something to be said about the survivor dynamic that Frampt's post-retirement behavior creates. The families of his victims, who are now receiving his contact years or decades after the original crimes, occupy a very specific psychological space. They thought they'd closed that chapter, built lives around the shape of the loss, found ways to continue. And now the chapter is being reopened, not with new violence, but with the reminder that he's still there, still thinking about them, still deriving something from their suffering. That's an extraordinarily cruel form of continued control. And it creates, for the show, a set of potential supporting characters, survivors, bereaved families, people whose lives have been distorted by Framti's continued existence, who could give Season 2 an emotional texture that the Prater storyline didn't quite manage. Prater's murder club was largely populated by killers. Framti's survivors are civilians who never asked to be part of any of this. That distinction matters for the moral weight of what Dexter's code is being asked to do with them. If the New York Ripper is a slow, patient psychological threat, someone who operates at the level of atmosphere and dread, the five-borough killer is something much more immediate. Owen Stark, played by Dan Stevens, is active. He's announcing his intentions via phone calls to the NYPD and then making good on them. Random, innocent people, not connected to him by anything Dexter or the police could easily verify, targeted sequentially across all five boroughs. It's theatrical in a way that's very different from Framt's quieter sadism. It's designed to create public panic as much as it's designed to kill. The Zodiac Killer is the obvious reference point, and the show seems fully aware of it. The Zodiac, operating in California in the late 1960s, sent letters and cryptograms to police and newspapers, claimed credit for killings in advance, and was never identified. The particular horror of the Zodiac case, beyond the murders themselves, was the sustained, deliberate communication. The killer wasn't hiding from notoriety. He was cultivating it, using public fear as part of the performance, watching the investigation with an almost editorial interest. Owen Stark is doing something structurally similar. The phone calls are not just practical, they're theatrical. They're part of the act. Dan Stevens is an interesting casting choice here because Stevens is very good at a certain kind of charm. Downton Abbey. The Guest, where he played a character whose pleasant surface energy concealed something deeply disturbing. Legion. He has a quality of apparent warmth and articulateness that can conceal almost anything beneath it, which is exactly the profile you'd expect for someone who can ring the NYPD threatening murder without sounding unhinged. Owen Stark is presumably composed, articulate, probably quite likable in whatever professional or social context he occupies outside of his extracurriculars. The contrast between the surface and what's underneath is the point. What's interesting about putting two killers at the center of a single season is that they demand fundamentally different responses from Dexter. The New York Ripper is a historical case, retired, methodical, accessible through his files and through whatever documentation Prater had assembled. Hunting Frampt is an investigative project, probably similar to the way Dexter used to work in Miami. Observe, verify, prepare. The Five-Borough Killer is real-time, active, creating public chaos on a schedule. Getting to Stark requires getting ahead of him, which means tracking a pattern before it generates its next target. Those are two completely different rhythms, and Dexter managing both simultaneously is structurally novel for this franchise. There's a theory among fans that Owen Stark doesn't know who Dexter is at the start of Season 2, but becomes aware of him through the investigation. The police are hunting the Five-Borough Killer, and Dexter is also hunting him. And their paths crossing creates the specific kind of thriller tension. Gets there first, what happens when they meet, whether a killer who announces himself to the police is also announcing himself to Dexter, that the franchise does very well. The Zodiac Killer was never caught partly because he stayed ahead of the investigation by studying it. If Stark is doing something similar, he might be studying Dexter before Dexter studies him. The code problem the Five-Borough Killer creates is also distinct from Frampt's, and it deserves its own attention. Frampt's victims were killed years ago. The verification is historical, files, records, documented crimes. The Five-Borough Killer's victims are happening now, which means Dexter is potentially in a position where acting too slowly costs innocent lives in the immediate term. That's never been quite the urgency dynamic the show has deployed before. Usually Dexter is hunting verified killers at his own pace. If Stark is announcing targets and then following through, the window between announcement and action is the window Dexter has to work within. That compresses everything in a way that the show hasn't had to deal with, and the code, which requires verification, preparation, ritual, may not be compatible with that kind of urgency. How Dexter reconciles that is a genuinely interesting question. For 8 seasons of the original run, and through New Blood, the Dexter format was essentially fixed. One primary antagonist per season. The cat and mouse plays out across the episode count, and by the finale, the antagonist is dead or resolved. Sometimes by Dexter's hand directly, sometimes not. But the season closes the loop it opened. The next season opens a new one. Season 1 of Resurrection started chipping away at that structure. Prater wasn't just an antagonist, he was a curator of antagonists, which meant Dexter was managing a menu of targets over the course of the season, rather than a single sustained threat. The Gemini Killer, Rapunzel, the Tattoo Collector, Lady Vengeance, each had their own time, their own resolution, or, in Al's case, non-resolution. The single villain architecture survived as an undercurrent, with Prater himself being the season's true climax. But the format was clearly being tested and stretched. Season 2 appears to be committing to the new format entirely. 2 series regular villains with distinct methodologies, presumably getting substantial screen time and distinct story arcs. Plus Charlie, whose alignment is deliberate unknown. Plus Rapunzel, who escaped into the Midwest with Dexter's file on him. Plus whatever Harrison is doing with his own sense of justice, which the official synopsis makes sound rather alarming. There's also a question of how Harrison factors into the multi-killer dynamic. In the original series, Harrison was a baby, then a small child, then an absent subplot. In New Blood, he was the emotional engine. In Resurrection Season 1, he was a co-protagonist of roughly equal weight. In Season 2, with his own sense of justice and his own potential targets, he might effectively be operating as a third track in the season. His kills and Dexter's kills and the investigation of the 2 confirmed serial killers all running simultaneously. That's an extraordinary amount of murderous activity for a single city to contain, but New York is nothing if not capacious. The creative advantage of this shift is flexibility. The original structure worked brilliantly for individual seasons when it worked. Trinity remains one of television's greatest antagonists precisely because the entire Season 4 architecture is built around the slow, patient revelation of what Arthur Mitchell actually is. But across 8 seasons of one villain apiece, certain structural elements started to feel repeated, certain beats felt predictable. Changing the format changes the rhythm, and when the rhythm changes, rewatch experiences change too. Prater's File Vault is also worth naming as one of the cleverest structural innovations the franchise has made. Those files on serial killers across America, documented with Prater's characteristic obsessiveness and cross-referenced in the way only a genuine obsessive could manage, are essentially a plot engine for as many seasons as the show wants to use them. Every file is a potential story. Every confirmed killer in that vault is justification for the code. It's not a run of coincidences and convenient encounters putting Dexter near criminals. It's a documented criminal ecosystem that he's now working through deliberately, systematically, the way he used to work through Miami Metro's unsolved cases. That's sustainable in a way the original format eventually stopped being. There's also a tonal effect to having multiple killers in a season that's worth thinking about. When the original show had a single primary antagonist, the season's emotional rhythm was built around that one relationship. Dexter tracking someone, learning who they are, getting closer, eventually confronting them. The whole season breathed in and out with that single dynamic. Multiple antagonists mean multiple emotional rhythms running simultaneously. Different paces, different textures, different kinds of threat. In practical terms, that makes the season harder to watch on a compressed binge schedule, but more satisfying at a weekly pace, because each episode can shift between those rhythms without feeling like it's abandoning anything. For sleep content, for slow, companionable viewing rather than breathless binging, multiple simultaneous threads are actually ideal. There's always something to settle into. The official synopsis for Season 2 contains a line I find genuinely intriguing. Harrison follows his own sense of justice as both face the darkest chapter in their lives. Not Dexter's code, not the code of Harry. Harrison's own sense of justice. That's a different thing entirely, and the distinction is everything. One of the most important conversations in Resurrection Season 1 happens when Dexter and Harrison finally acknowledge to each other what they are. And what they discover in that conversation is that their dark passengers don't manifest the same way. Dexter's is methodical, it requires preparation, ritual, confirmation of guilt, plastic wrap, and a syringe of M99 and time and surveillance and verification. It's almost compulsive in its formality, the way certain kinds of anxiety produce elaborate compensatory structure. Harrison's appears to be impulsive. He killed Ryan Foster in the heat of the moment, without a plan, without verification, without the stabilizing framework that Harry spent years building into Dexter. That's not a dark passenger with a code. That's just violence that found a target. Harry designed the code specifically to contain and channel a version of what Harrison has. But Harry designed it for Dexter, a particular kind of mind, a particular relationship with order and control and the need for ritual. It was always a personal solution, not a universal one. Whether the code is transferable to Harrison, whose psychology is demonstrably different, is one of the show's most interesting open questions. And the Season 2 synopsis's emphasis on Harrison following his own sense of justice suggests the answer is no, or at least not in the form Harry designed it. The 4-year gap between seasons adds layers to this. Harrison has had those years to live with what he knows about himself, to make choices about it. The synopsis suggests he's arrived somewhere, not at the code, not at pure unchecked impulse, but at something he's worked out for himself, his own framework for whatever it is he does. That's actually more unsettling than either extreme would be in a way. A Harrison who'd adopted Harry's code wholesale would be a recognizable quantity. A Harrison acting on pure impulse would be a problem with an obvious shape. A Harrison who has developed his own moral architecture over 4 years, in isolation from Dexter's guidance, operating by principles we haven't been shown yet, that's genuinely unknown territory. and the NYPD thread adds another layer entirely. Harrison, by all indications from the confirmed cast and set photos, is working around or within the NYPD homicide department in season 2, pursuing some form of professional role there, which would make him the latest in what is, when you step back and look at it, a remarkable Morgan family tradition of proximity to law enforcement. Harry was a Miami Metro detective. Dexter spent his career as a forensic blood spatter analyst embedded in a police department. Deborah was a homicide detective who eventually made lieutenant. Harrison pursuing law enforcement while carrying what he carries, knowing what he knows, is either the most reckless possible choice or a piece of extremely astute instinct. Maybe it's both, which might be the most Harrison thing imaginable. There's a reading of his arc that positions him as potentially more dangerous than Dexter at this point in the story. Dexter has decades of experience managing his dark passenger. He knows its shape, its rhythms, its triggers. He's made enormous mistakes, but he's survived all of them, and each one has refined his understanding of his own limitations. Harrison is still in the early stages of that process. He's younger, less structured, more emotionally volatile. And he's now apparently trying to work within a system that is specifically designed to catch people exactly like him, while also dating the daughter of the man who runs that system. The irony is spectacular. If the show handles it with the care it deserves, this could be Harrison's most compelling season yet. Jack Alcott has been good in this role since New Blood, and Resurrection Season 1 gave him considerably more to work with than his initial introduction suggested. The father-son dynamic in Season 1 worked partly because the show resisted the obvious choice, having them become a functional team, working kills together, making the Dark Passenger a shared family enterprise. Instead, it showed two people with incompatible versions of the same condition, trying to work out how to be near each other without either of them being destroyed by the proximity. That tension is presumably still there in Season 2, possibly more pronounced than ever. Since we're on the topic of Harrison, the specific way the show has handled his trauma history is something I keep coming back to. He was sitting in his mother's blood as an infant, the same visual echo of Dexter's own origin that the writers have been drawing on since New Blood. Both Morgan men have that foundational image in their histories, but Dexter's origin produced the Dark Passenger in a child too young to process it, and Harry then intervened with the code before Dexter was old enough to develop anything on his own. Harrison didn't get that intervention. He grew up without Dexter, bounced through foster systems after Hannah died, and has been managing whatever he carries without any guidance from someone who understood it until relatively recently. The question of whether Dexter arriving 4 years ago was too late, whether Harrison's Dark Passenger has already taken a shape that can't be redirected now, the way Harry's early intervention arguably redirected Dexter's, is one the show hasn't yet answered. And the own sense of justice framing of Season 2 suggests it might be about to. There's a version of Harrison's arc where his framework, built in isolation and without Harry's code, turns out to be actually more functional than Dexter's. More emotionally grounded, less ritualistic, less dependent on the elaborate structure that Dexter has always needed. And there's a version where it turns out to be more dangerous. Both are interesting. Both are possible. There's also something specifically interesting about Harrison's relationship to guilt. Dexter, across the original series, spent a great deal of energy not feeling guilty, or more precisely, constructing a framework that made guilt unnecessary by defining his kills as justified. The code was partly about efficacy and concealment, but it was also about moral cleanliness. Harrison's impulsive kill of Ryan Foster in Season 1 was followed by visible guilt, visible crisis, a genuine reckoning with what he'd done that Dexter in his early years simply didn't have. Whether that guilt is a weakness, something the Dark Passenger will eventually burn through, or whether it's actually a strength, a kind of moral compass that Dexter was never equipped with, is one of the most interesting questions the show has set up about its younger protagonist. In the Dexter franchise, when a character's new love interest turns out to be the daughter of the person who runs the police unit investigating people like them, It is never a coincidence, and it is never just a romantic subplot. The show has a history, a long, consistent history of using intimacy as a vector for danger. And the season 2 setup around Harrison and Fiona Mixon is one of the more precisely engineered versions of this that the franchise has attempted. Here's the situation. Harrison, who killed someone in season 1 and whose father is the believed dead Bay Harper Butcher, is apparently pursuing work within or alongside NYPD homicide. He falls for Fiona Mixon, played by Nona Parker Johnson, a training officer in that same homicide unit. And Fiona's father, Captain Mixon, played by Bokeem Woodbine, runs the squad. Fiona is described in the official materials as a Nepo baby in the police world, which suggests she secured her position through family connection rather than through a purely competitive process, and which might mean she has something significant to prove professionally. That's a person who's paying close attention and doesn't want to be seen making mistakes. The layers of precariousness in this arrangement are almost architectural in their elegance. Harrison dating the captain's daughter, while potentially being investigated by that same captain's department, while concealing a killing, while protecting his father's existence, while carrying a dark passenger that has already expressed itself through impulsive violence once, and that the season 2 synopsis suggests is going to express itself again. At some point in all of that, something is going to give. The question is which part gives first. The obvious theory about Captain Mixon himself is worth addressing. The show has a long tradition of authority figures who are not what they appear, from Captain Matthews in the original series covering up his own misconduct, to Kurt Caldwell in New Blood presenting as Iron Lake's respected patriarch while hiding decades of murders. A police captain who turns out to be dirty or worse is a familiar move in crime drama, and the show almost has to subvert it to be interesting. The specific fan theory that Mixon might be one of the killers in Prater's files is circulating, and it has a neat narrative logic. Harrison falling for someone whose father is on Dexter's list, creating a conflict between the code and the relationship. Whether the show goes there or whether Mixon is exactly what he appears, a hard-nosed, honest cop, the presence of a police captain who is simultaneously Fiona's father, and Harrison's professional context creates danger in almost every direction. Nona Parker Johnson is primarily known for procedural drama, Law and Order, Mayor of Kingstown, shows that require playing characters who are perceptive and professionally motivated under sustained pressure. Fiona, as a training officer trying to distinguish herself in her father's department, sounds like someone who is actively observant about the people around her. That's not an ideal quality in the person you're hoping to keep secrets from. And yet, the attraction makes a kind of psychological sense for Harrison, even if it makes no practical sense. He's grown up around law enforcement. It's the Morgan family's ambient environment. There's presumably something comfortable and familiar about it, and there's possibly something more complicated going on too. The pull toward the system that would catch and condemn him, the specific tension of being seen by someone with the professional training to look, the desire to be known that Dexter has always had and always suppressed. Harrison, who is younger and less practiced at suppression, might not suppress it as effectively. Falling for a homicide officer is, depending on how you read it, either a death wish or an attempt at honest living. Maybe both simultaneously. Maybe Harrison hasn't fully worked out which. The Fiona thread also creates a natural point of conflict with Dexter, who will presumably recognize the danger of the relationship before Harrison does. Dexter telling Harrison to end it and Harrison refusing, possibly for reasons neither of them can fully articulate, is the kind of father-son tension the show has been building towards since New Blood. Not about the code specifically, but about control and autonomy and how much of his father's judgment Harrison is actually willing to take on board. Since we're talking about the Mixon family, this setup also does something specific for Detective Wallace's Season 2 arc that I think is underappreciated in how the season is structured. Wallace spent most of Season 1 investigating the Empire Hotel murder. and getting uncomfortably close to the truth about Harrison without quite getting there. In Season 2, with Harrison now potentially embedded in her department through Fiona and Captain Mixon, that proximity becomes considerably more fraught. She's now in a position where she's working alongside or around the person she was investigating, with his romantic involvement with her colleague's daughter creating social ties that would make any renewed suspicion professionally complicated. The show is essentially putting Wallace in a position where the investigation and the personal are hopelessly entangled, which is exactly the kind of structural situation it generates best tension from. The question of whether Fiona herself ever suspects anything about Harrison, whether the professional training that made her a homicide officer eventually turns its gaze on the person she's closest to, is something the season will presumably hold in reserve as a potential late development. In Dexter, the person who gets closest to the truth is almost always the person with the most personal stake in not finding it. Fiona is set up for exactly that position. Desmond Harrington as Joey Quinn, promoted from Season 1 guest star to Season 2 series regular. This is the piece of casting news that generated probably the most sustained discussion among people who've watched the original series closely, because Quinn's relationship to the Bay Harbor Butcher question has been one of those long-running ambiguities the show planted and then never quite resolved. And it looks like Season 2 is the resolution. Let me lay out the theory properly, because it requires a bit of original series context. Quinn first appears around Season 3 of the original show as a somewhat morally flexible Miami Metro homicide detective. Not corrupt exactly, but definitely someone who operates according to his own sense of what matters rather than strict adherence to procedure. He and Dexter were never close, but they were never enemies either until Season 5, when Quinn hired a private investigator named Stan Liddy to secretly surveil Dexter. Quinn was suspicious. He didn't know precisely what he was suspicious of, but he knew something was wrong in the way certain people know things without being able to articulate the evidence for it. What kind of detective Quinn actually was in the original series matters for understanding what he might do with his suspicions in Season 2, and I don't think this gets discussed enough. He wasn't a crusader. He wasn't someone who had pursued justice at personal cost with no thought for himself. He was pragmatic, sometimes morally compromised, capable of letting things go when letting things go was the easier option. The Quinn who hired Liddy in Season 5 was operating on gut feeling, not principle. He thought something was wrong with Dexter Morgan, and he wanted to know what. Not because he was going to arrest him if he found it, because he wanted to know. That's a different motivation from the one that drove Batista, and it produces a different kind of threat, or a different kind of potential alliance. Liddy found things. He found enough that the surveillance became very uncomfortable for Dexter, who eventually killed Liddy and covered it up. Quinn subsequently discovered Liddy's body and the van where the surveillance had been conducted. By any reasonable reading of that situation, and this is the part that's been debated for over a decade, Quinn put at least part of the picture together. He didn't act on it, he didn't pursue it, he let it go. The question is why. The two most credible explanations are not mutually exclusive. First, he genuinely couldn't prove anything. Dexter cleaned up effectively enough that the available evidence didn't support a conviction. And Quinn, whatever his failings, wasn't going to accuse a colleague without something solid. Second, his relationship with Deborah made the emotional calculus impossible. They were together, on and off, for much of the original series, pursuing something that might destroy Deborah's brother while being in love with Deborah. Even Quinn, who is not always the most emotionally intelligent person in the room, might have chosen to look elsewhere. Some doors are easier to leave closed, but Deborah is dead. That complication is gone. And now Batista, Quinn's former captain, someone he knew and presumably respected across years of working together, has turned up dead in a Manhattan billionaire's mansion. Quinn is going to come north to find out what happened. He doesn't know the full context. He doesn't know that Batista came to New York specifically to investigate whether the Bay Harbor Butcher was alive. But whatever he does know, or suspects about Dexter Morgan's history is going to come with him. Screen Rant described this as a 16-year-old theory getting its day, which is a fair summary of the fan response to Harrington's promotion to series regular. The specific mechanics of what Quinn knew and when have been argued about in forums since 2011, and Season 2 is apparently the season that provides the answer. Whether it's a full Quinn always knew and chose not to act revelation, or a more gradual Quinn is assembling it in real time now that he's in New York at Rashtin's. The presence of a series regular Quinn changes the dynamic of how exposed Dexter actually is, and the knowledge situation at the start of Season 2 is worth pausing on for a second. By the start of Season 2, the Bay Harbor Butcher, knowledge is held by 3 people, Dexter, Harrison, and Charlie. That's a remarkably small number given everything that's happened. Quinn, arriving in New York and starting to ask questions, is the first real investigative pressure Dexter has faced since Batista. And Quinn is in some ways harder to manage than Batista was. Batista came from a place of grief and certainty. He was following a thread because he believed in it. Quinn comes from a place of long-standing, unresolved suspicion, which is different. Grief can be redirected. Suspicion that's been quietly maintained for 16 years is a great deal harder to diffuse. The alternative reading, and I want to be fair to it, is that Quinn comes to New York as a potential ally rather than a threat. If he does know or strongly suspect, and if he made the choice not to act on it once, he might make that choice again. Especially if some part of him understands why Dokes was wrong and Dexter was right, which is a morally complicated position but not an incoherent one. A Quinn who knows, chooses silence, and becomes a reluctant participant in Dexter's world is a more interesting story than a Quinn who's just a detective closing in. And it might be the more honest one, given what we know about his history. There's a Deborah angle here that I don't think gets enough attention. Quinn and Deborah's relationship is one of the original series' more emotionally rich subplots, complicated, on and off, occasionally maddening, but clearly meaningful to both of them. Deborah chose to protect Dexter over her own conscience, ultimately shooting La Guerta to keep his secret. And that choice destroyed something in her. Quinn watched the person he cared about most be destroyed by her loyalty to her brother. Whether that produces rage at Dexter or a strange kind of understanding, the sense that whatever Dexter is, he was important enough to Deborah that she gave everything for him, is something that could go in several directions. But it's not a simple thing. Quinn arriving in New York doesn't just bring the Liddy investigation and the Batista thread. He brings the full weight of Deborah's ending. And that is going to be present in every scene he shares with Dexter, regardless of what the dialogue is actually about. Kristen Ritter's coming back to Dexter, Resurrection Season 2. Deadline confirmed it. What she's coming back as is, as of now, officially unspecified, which means the speculation is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting and has been since the news broke. Mia LaPierre, Lady Vengeance, appeared in 3 episodes of Season 1. She was, in her way, the most interesting member of Prater's Dinner Club, because she presented as someone who had actually constructed a moral framework for her violence rather than simply acting on compulsion or pathology. She targeted men who had harmed women. She had a following online, people who knew what she was doing and cheered for it, which says something interesting about the cultural moment and about how far the show's moral universe has shifted from its Miami origins. And she clearly believed in what she was doing with a conviction that none of the other club members could match. Dexter was drawn to her, not romantically exactly, but there was something in the air between them. Recognition, the specific warmth of meeting someone who seems to understand the texture of what you carry. She found in Dexter someone who appeared to share her framework, someone for whom killing was principled rather than recreational. He found in her the closest thing he'd encountered in a long time to another person operating by a code. And then came the complication. Dexter eventually realized that Mia's code wasn't as disciplined as she presented it. She killed when she wanted to, targeting people who matched her category but without the rigor and restraint that Harry's code requires. She didn't verify, she didn't ensure certainty. She acted on her own judgment and called it principle after the fact. That's the line for Dexter. You can be a killer with genuine principles. You cannot be a killer who uses the language of principles as retrospective justification for whatever you felt like doing. So he framed her for Ryan Foster's murder, Harrison's kill, pinned on Mia. Charlie arranged her apparent death in prison via a guard Prater had on payroll. And as far as the audience was told, that was the end of Lady Vengeance. Now there are 3 ways she comes back, and each one implies something different about the season's shape. The most precedented option is the ghost or hallucination. Dexter's internal world is populated by the dead he feels some mixture of guilt and connection toward, Harry obviously as the permanent resident, but also Deb in New Blood and Brian M.O.E. Zare, and in Resurrection's first season, Dokes, Prado, and Trinity all appeared in memory or vision sequences. Mia fits this space reasonably well. Dexter participated directly in her downfall. He recognized something in her and then betrayed it. Whatever she was to him, she wasn't nothing. A version of Mia appearing in his mind, questioning his choices, pushing back against the code in ways Harry doesn't, representing the part of him that wondered what a different framework might look like, would be a natural addition to that crowded internal landscape. The flashback option is simpler and possibly more targeted. A flashback could serve specific story purposes, illuminating Mia's backstory before she joined Prater's circle, revealing how Charlie recruited her, showing what went on behind the scenes at those dinner parties in ways that matter for Season 2's plot. A flashback doesn't require the show to explain her survival. It just requires good storytelling reasons for revisiting that ground. The faked death theory is the one that fans are most enthusiastic about, and I can see the appeal because if it's true, it changes the season's shape considerably. The theory goes like this. Charlie paid off the prison guard not to kill Mia, but to stage her death and extract her. Given that Charlie herself had become profoundly ambivalent about Prater's operation, and given that she had a file in his vault just like everyone else, it's not impossible that she chose to protect Mia rather than eliminate her. The financial motivation that kept Charlie loyal to Prater was gone. By the time she made this arrangement, she'd already decided to leave. Maybe she used her last act in Prater's employ to spare someone she thought deserved better than a prison cell. This version requires Mia to have been somewhere for 4 years, living under the assumption that everyone thinks she's dead. What she's been doing in that time and why she resurfaces in Season 2 would then be the story. And Charlie, who is confirmed returning, is the only person who would know where to find her. The 2 threads intersecting, Charlie returning to New York, Mia surfacing somewhere, has a reasonable narrative logic to it. There's a 4th consideration that doesn't get discussed as much, and it's about what Mia represents thematically to the show's moral landscape rather than just narratively. Mia's Lady Vengeance persona had genuine cultural resonance in her fictional world. She was celebrated by parts of the public for doing something people thought was just. Yet that public dimension of her story is unusual in the Dexter universe, where killers generally operate in secret. The franchise has occasionally gestured toward the question of whether Dexter's version of justice is more or less legitimate than the justice he's circumventing. But Mia was a character who forced that question in a public, explicit way. Her victims' victims were her advocates. Her method was admired. Dexter found her principled framework insufficient for the code, and that's correct within the code's terms. But the code's terms aren't the only terms in play. A Mia who comes back in any form brings that moral question back with her. And in a season where Dexter is having a midlife crisis about the code itself, her return arrives at exactly the right moment to complicate his thinking. I've always thought Mia's 3 episodes in Season 1 were among the most interesting in the season, not because of the plot they drove, but because of what they revealed about Dexter's current relationship with his own code. He wasn't repelled by her. He was interested, even briefly, something like hopeful. The fact that she ultimately failed his test says less about her than it does about how exacting the code is, and how much of Dexter is invested in that exactness. Season 2, revisiting that in any of the 3 possible forms, is an opportunity the show would be unwise to waste. There's something almost funny about how Season 1 treated Al Walker. Eric Stonestreet, best known for Modern Family, a show about as far from Dexter in tone as television gets, played him as the most disarmingly normal person in a room full of murderers. Wholesome, family-oriented, the kind of man you'd trust to run the school car boot sale without a second thought. And then there's the detail about the ponytails. Al, or Rapunzel as Prater labeled him in his files, collected the hair of his female victims. Not as part of any particularly elaborate ritual, just as trophies, the way certain collectors accumulate things that represent experiences they want to keep track of, which is somehow worse when you think about what the experiences were. He targeted women, killed them, and kept their ponytails, then went home to his family in the Midwest, presumably helped with homework and put out the bins, and nobody in his life was any the wiser. He escaped. And in a show that, across its entire original run and through New Blood, almost never left a code-justified kill genuinely incomplete, that incompleteness is an anomaly. Anomalies in a show like this tend to mean something. Dexter has the file. He took it from Prater's vault along with everything else. He knows who Al is, where he lives, what he's done, the documented evidence of his guilt. Every piece of justification the code requires is sitting in a dossier assembled by a man who, whatever his many failings, was extraordinarily thorough about his documentation. Dexter has, in effect, been handed a fully prepared case file on a verified killer he never got to reach. The code is not known for allowing that kind of unfinished business to sit indefinitely. Whether Eric Stonestreet returns for Season 2 hasn't been confirmed in the sources I've found. But the loose thread is there, and the show presumably knows exactly where it left it. My guess, and it's only that, is that Al becomes an early season resolution, a way of using the file vault's infrastructure, establishing that Dexter is still working methodically through what Prater left him, and settling the Season 1 business before the Season 2 business takes over. Dexter following someone back to small-town America, doing his surveillance, completing the kill away from the city. That's a distinct tonal register from the New York material, and it could serve as a useful contrast in the season's early episodes. The Al thread also raises a question the show hasn't had to ask before. What does Dexter do with the knowledge that someone he's identified as a code-qualifying target is living in a place he can't easily reach, surrounded by a family who has no idea what he is? The original code was designed for Miami. It assumed proximity, assumed Dexter's ability to observe and verify and prepare in an environment he understood. Working from files on people across America requires an entirely different operational approach. Does Dexter travel? Does he establish a network of contacts the way Prater did? Does he work remotely in some form? These questions don't have answers yet, but they're genuinely interesting structural questions for what the franchise becomes over multiple seasons. I want to spend some time here because Batista's death in the Season 1 finale is the kind of narrative event that a show can easily underuse if it's not paying attention, and the ripple effects of it through Season 2 are likely to be significant. Angel was one of the great supporting characters of the original Dexter series. David Zayas played him for all 8 original seasons, years of being the moral center of Miami Metro homicide, the person who genuinely tried to do things right, the warm and competent and occasionally exasperated colleague who never once made you doubt that he was a good man trying to do an honest job. He was Dexter's closest professional relationship across the original run, which means he was also the person whose friendship Dexter was most continuously betraying, even though Batista never knew it. There's something quietly tragic in that if you think about it. All that genuine affection built on a lie Batista never suspected, And across 8 seasons, Batista's own personal life, his marriages, his relationship with the job, the way the violence he investigated gradually changed his experience of Miami, was developed with a consistency and care that most supporting characters in procedural drama don't receive. He was a person, not just a function. His grief over La Guerta's death in Season 7 was one of the most honest moments in a season that was asking very hard questions about loyalty and justice and what it costs to be on the right side of the law. Zayas played all of it without a false note. Losing Batista in Season 1 of Resurrection wasn't just a narrative event. It was the loss of a specific quality of decency from the franchise's world. And that quality, the person who is simply, consistently trying to do right, doesn't have an obvious replacement. When he came to New York in Season 1, he came because he believed the Bay Harbor Butcher was still alive and that the Miami Metro case had been closed on a false premise. He was following a thread that had haunted him across years. And he was right. He found his way to Prater, and Prater shot him. That moment closes the original series' last active investigative thread in a single brutal beat. Batista's death is the show paying a real cost, sacrificing one of its most beloved legacy characters to signal that no one is protected by sentimental attachment to the original run. It changes how the audience watches Season 2. But it also opens several new threads that the season will need to address. The first is practical. Only 3 people know the full circumstances of how Batista died: Dexter, Harrison, and Charlie. The NYPD is presumably investigating, but they're missing the most important context that Batista came to New York specifically to investigate whether the Bay Harbor Butcher was alive, and that his pursuit of that question is what put him in Prater's orbit. Without that context, any investigation into his death is working with a fundamentally incomplete picture. The second is the dossier theory, which I find genuinely compelling as a piece of narrative logic. Batista was meticulous and methodical. He was also acutely aware of the history. He knew that every person who had seriously pursued the Bay Harbor Butcher question before him had ended up dead. Dokes, La Guerta, the case had a way of killing the people who cared about it most. He knew the risks going to New York. It seems reasonable to suppose that he, being the careful professional he always was, prepared some form of record of his findings before going to meet Prater. Notes, recorded observations, evidence of where his investigation had taken him, addressed to someone he trusted, to be released if something happened to him. If that dossier exists and reaches Quinn, who's coming to New York in Season 2, the complexity of the investigation threads multiplies significantly. Quinn would arrive not just with his own long-standing unresolved suspicions, but with Batista's documented ones. That's a considerably more difficult situation for Dexter to manage. The third thread is simply the emotional weight of the loss, which the show will presumably have to acknowledge and process. Batista wasn't just a plot mechanism, he was, for a large portion of the audience, the character who represented what Miami Metro could have been, what it briefly was, in its best moments. Losing him in Season 1 was the show paying a price that it hasn't fully accounted for yet, and Season 2 owes that accounting something, and there's a residual question about Vince Mizuka, the forensic analyst played by C.S. Lee, who was a series regular through all 8 original seasons, and who made a brief appearance in Resurrection Season 1. Masuka was a Batista's peer, his friend, someone who shared the Miami Metro years with him across the entire original run. He presumably doesn't yet know that Batista is dead, or if he does, he doesn't know the circumstances. There's a question of whether Season 2 gives us a scene in which that news reaches Miami, and what the ripple of it looks like in the people who knew Batista best. Not because the franchise needs to dwell on it at length, but because Batista was loved by characters as well as audiences, and the world of the show acknowledging that grief feels like something Season 2 owes. James Remmer has been playing Harry Morgan across more versions of this franchise than seems quite possible. not as a living character, but as a manifestation of Dexter's conscience, a projection of the man who shaped him, appearing in moments of conflict or moral confusion, providing the voice of the framework that Harry installed in Dexter before either of them fully understood what they were working with. The mechanics of Harry's appearance have shifted across the franchise iterations. In the original series, he was mostly the authoritative voice of the code, present to remind Dexter of the rules, to warn him when he was getting too close to exposure, to function as the internal check on his behavior. In New Blood, the Harry projection was more complicated, occasionally expressing something like regret, questioning whether the code had been designed for the situation it was now being asked to address. In Resurrection Season 1, he was there throughout, urging Dexter to reconnect with Harrison, providing moral scaffolding in an unfamiliar city. The Season 2 official synopsis describes Dexter struggling with a midlife crisis, and I find this phrase genuinely surprising as applied to this particular character. A midlife crisis is usually about questioning the life you built, feeling that the choices you made were wrong, or that the values you've been operating by don't actually reflect who you are. For most people, this manifests as buying an impractical vehicle or reconsidering professional choices. For Dexter Morgan, who has built his entire existence around a moral framework his adoptive father gave him before he fully understood what he was, the equivalent question is a great deal more loaded. As we talked about in the Harrison section, the code has been evolving and probably doesn't fit either of them quite the way Harry designed it. But what's specific to this section is what the midlife crisis framing means for Dexter's relationship with Harry's ghost itself. The interesting question is what Harry's ghost does with that. The projection of Harry in Dexter's mind is, in some ways, a construction, a version of his father filtered through decades of Dexter's own interpretation and need. When Dexter questions the code, he's not actually questioning his father, he's questioning himself. The Harry who appears in his mind is the Harry Dexter needs in order to process whatever he's facing, which means that Harry's ghost has actually shifted and evolved across the seasons in parallel with Dexter's own shifts, even though it presents as a fixed external authority. There's a conversation in the original series where Dexter and the vision of Harry discuss whether the dark passenger is actually real, or whether it's just a name for choices Dexter is making and then attributing to an external force, a way of avoiding personal responsibility for what he is. It's one of the more quietly devastating exchanges in the original show, partly because the question doesn't have a comfortable answer and partly because Dexter doesn't want it to have a comfortable answer. He needs the dark passenger to be real. He needs the code to be a genuine constraint rather than a rationalization. The midlife crisis of Season 2 sounds like a return to that territory from a position of considerably more experience and considerably more loss, and with Charlie's presence in his life potentially forcing the question in new ways. What does the code mean when the person who knows you best isn't your dead father's ghost? One concrete way this might manifest, Dexter's relationship with the ritual of the kill. The kill room, the plastic wrap, the trophy. These are the ceremonial elements of the code, the things that distinguish Dexter's version of what he does from simple violence. But those rituals were designed in the 1970s and 1980s by a detective who had certain specific concerns about his son's safety and emotional stability. They were designed for a particular operational context and a particular psychology. In New York, with 4 years of presumably continued activity, it seems likely that Dexter has adapted those rituals, refined them, possibly changed them significantly. The midlife crisis question of who am I without the framework I was given maps quite directly onto what does the code look like when I'm the one deciding what it means? And that's a question Dexter, who has always received the code rather than generated it, may not have a ready answer for. Harry's ghost, functioning as it does as Dexter's own interpretation of his father rather than his actual father, can't answer it for him either. The ghost says what Dexter needs it to say, shaped by Dexter's own evolving understanding. If Dexter is changing and the midlife crisis framing suggests he is, then the Harry in his head is changing too. That's the specific loneliness of the situation, and it's the kind of loneliness that Season 2 appears to be setting itself the task of exploring. This is easy to overlook because the evidence for it is specific and came from production news rather than anything the show has officially announced. A newspaper prop on the Season 2 set. The New York Daily News, printed specifically for filming, clearly shows the date. Tuesday, June 16, 2026. Set photographs of Uma Thurman in character show her with what appears to be an iPhone 17 Pro, placing the action in a period after 2025. The conclusion, Season 2 takes place in June 2026, more than 4 years after Season 1, which was set in early 2022. That's the largest time jump between seasons in any iteration of this franchise that occurs within a continuous storyline. The original series moved season to season roughly in real time. New Blood jumped approximately a decade, but that was after the original finale, after Dexter had been in hiding for years. Here, within the Resurrection continuity, going from early 2022 to mid-2026 is a significant creative choice, and it comes with questions the season will need to address. What has Dexter been doing for those 4 years? The season ends with him in New York, with Prater dead, Harrison somewhere in his orbit, Charlie gone, and a vault full of files on killers he hasn't reached yet. He has no cover identity, no professional role, no visible means of income in any narrative we've been told. The man who spent a decade as Jim Lindsay, a sporting goods shop employee in Iron Lake, is now presumably living some version of a life in the city that his ending monologue suggested he had accepted as home. The practical questions, how he supports himself, what his daily existence looks like, whether he's been quietly working through Prater's files in the background, are things the show will presumably illuminate through dialogue and implication rather than a flashback sequence covering 4 years of suburban routines. What Harrison has been doing in those years is, if anything, more interesting. At the end of Season 1, he was a young man in genuine crisis about what he is, trying to understand the distance between his father's structure and his own impulsiveness, trying to figure out whether the code is something that can be adapted or whether he needs something else entirely. 4 years later, the official synopsis says he's following his own sense of justice. Something happened in those years that moved him from confusion to conviction. The path from, I don't know how to manage this, to I have my own framework now, is exactly the kind of internal development that a time jump can suggest without having to depict directly. Charlie's 4-year absence is its own question. She left New York with her mother under a truce she may or may not have been happy about. She's back in Season 2. The set photos suggest she's in a profoundly different relationship with Dexter's than she was when she left. 4 years is enough time for an enormous amount to happen, for contact to develop, for trust to build, for people who parted on mutual leverage to find their way to something more genuinely voluntary. Whether those 4 years of whatever it was are depicted on screen or communicated through the texture of how the characters interact, the relationship has clearly changed. And there's a question sitting under all of this about what Dexter has learned in 4 years of living in New York without a professional cover. In Miami, being embedded in Miami Metro homicide gave him access to information, to crime scenes, to intelligence about the criminal ecosystem of the city. In Iron Lake, being Jim Lindsay gave him enough community cover to operate invisibly. In New York, at the start of Season 1, he had nothing except Harrison's rough location and a set of skills. By the end of Season 1, he had Prater's files, blessing as a landlord, and a preliminary understanding of the city's particular rhythms. 4 years of applying that to New York, observing, learning the geography of who does what and where, identifying the pressure points, would have made him considerably more operational than he was at the season's start. Season 2's Dexter is presumably a Dexter who knows his city. That's a different proposition from Season 1's Dexter, who was finding his feet, and it should feel different on screen. The time jump also has a structural function. It separates Season 2 clearly from Season 1, giving the show room to be its own thing rather than a direct continuation of the previous year's momentum. Season 1 was about arrival, Dexter arriving in New York, finding Harrison, navigating Prater's world. Season 2, set 4 years later, is presumably about what he's made of the arrival. What New York has done to him or for him, that's a different story. And the specific date is interesting in a way that might be coincidental or might not be. June 2026, the original Dexter series premiered in October 2006. That makes the events of Season 2 of Resurrection the 20th anniversary of the franchise's existence, more or less. I don't think that's the in-universe reason the writers chose that timeline. The production schedule explains the choice perfectly well without any anniversary significance, but it's a pleasant coincidence. Or not a coincidence, the franchise is in its 20th year. Its protagonist is wrestling with a midlife crisis. The show is questioning structures that were built 2 decades ago and asking whether they still fit the people they were built for. There's a thematic rhyme there, even if it's accidental. Hall and Phillips have both described Resurrection as designed for multiple seasons, with at least 3 in the original plan, and the possibility of more depending on how the story develops. This is not a limited series hedging its bets. It's an ongoing narrative with a longer horizon. And the decisions being made in Season 2 are not just about Season 2, they're about what the franchise wants to be over the next several years. The cancellation of Dexter, Original Sin, in August 2025, despite having received a renewal announcement, concentrated the franchise's energy back into Resurrection as the primary active thread. Original Sin, set in 1991 Miami, following young Dexter under Harry's tutelage, with Patrick Gibson as Dexter and Christian Slater as Harry, had its own appeal, particularly in the way it dramatized the formative years of the Code. The specific texture of Harry teaching Dexter to channel what he was into something structured. It was canceled after 1 season. Resurrection is what remains of the expanding universe, and it's carrying the full weight of the franchise now. And carrying it well, by any reasonable measure. The renewal wasn't just commercially motivated, it was artistically justified by a season that did what franchise revivals rarely manage, which is to find a genuine reason for the story to continue rather than simply repeating its most popular elements. Season 1 of Resurrection had to answer the question, what does Dexter Morgan want now? Not what is he afraid of, or what is he running from, but what does he actually want, in the active sense? The answer was Harrison. And Resurrection Season 1 spent its 10 episodes showing how that wanting played out in the specific circumstances of New York City in 2022. Season 2 has to answer a different version of the same question, now that Harrison is no longer the immediate crisis and Dexter is more settled in his city. What does he want now that he's stayed? That's a harder question and a more interesting one. The Unnamed Trinity Killer prequel series, focused on Arthur Mitchell's early life and murders in the 1970s, is apparently still in development. John Lithgow reprised Trinity in Resurrection Season 1's vision sequences, appearing in Dexter's memory as a figure from his past, which may have been partly a way of keeping the character visible to audiences while the prequel was still being developed. When it arrives, it'll occupy a completely different tonal register from Resurrection, being set 50 years earlier, and it'll require telling the story of one of the franchise's greatest antagonists from the inside, which is a genuinely interesting creative challenge. Trinity as a young man, before the ritual calcified, before the family was built around the compulsion, there's a story there about how someone becomes what Arthur Mitchell became, and it's a story the franchise is apparently committed to telling. What Resurrection's long-term future most resembles, structurally, is a prestige procedural with a continuing protagonist. Dexter in a city, working through a documented ecosystem of verified targets, managing the people around him who know or suspect the truth, maintaining the code while the code itself evolves under the pressure of his own changing sense of self. Prater's file vault is the mechanism that keeps this sustainable without requiring a run of coincidences to put Dexter near killers every season. Every file is a potential story. Every confirmed killer in that vault is the code's justification for action. It's elegant infrastructure, and the show is clearly aware of it. Whether it continues to produce output worth the effort depends almost entirely on whether the writing room keeps doing what Resurrection Season 1 mostly managed, telling a story about this specific character at this specific point in his life, with specific people around him who have their own weight and texture, rather than simply recycling the pleasures of the original series in a new setting. The original series was great partly because of the period it was made in and the specific performances it assembled. Resurrection has to be great for different reasons. So far, it appears to understand that. Michael C. Hall has said in various interviews around the Season 1 period that he finds Dexter more interesting now than he was in the original series. Older, more self-aware, carrying more accumulated weight, less certain about the architecture of the self he was given by Harry and then built on top of. That's a genuinely interesting perspective from the person who has inhabited this character across every version of it. If that engagement sustains through Season 2 and beyond, the franchise is in good hands. And Hall's willingness to commit long-term suggests it will. Now, the 3-season plan also implies something about where the story is eventually going, even if the specifics are entirely opaque. A 3-season arc with a possible extension is the kind of structure that typically means the writers have an ending in mind, a destination that the seasons are pointing toward, even if the path there is adjustable depending on how the story develops. What that destination might be is genuinely unknown at this stage. Whether it involves Dexter finally being caught, or finally choosing to walk away, or facing a consequence from Harrison or Charlie or Quinn or someone entirely new that brings the whole structure down around him, I don't know. But the sense that the show knows where it's going is reassuring in a way that the original series, which ran on renewal cycles without a planned conclusion, wasn't always able to provide. The franchise began in 2006 with a man carrying a blood slide box on a boat in the Florida Keys, narrating his own inner life with such precision that you immediately understood something fundamental about who he was. It is now, 20 years later, asking what it costs to still be that man. That's a long time for any story to keep finding the same question interesting, and Resurrection seems to understand why it still is, and I think that's a reasonable place to land for tonight. There's more that could be said. There always is with Dexter. The franchise is one of those subjects that keeps producing new angles the more you look at it, partly because the mythology is genuinely rich, and partly because the central character is genuinely complex in ways that sustain analysis across a very long time. We barely touched the Bay Harbor butcher mythology in its entirety tonight, and there's an entire conversation to be had about the code's internal logic and where it's been quietly inconsistent across the original run. That's for another evening. We didn't get into the details of the original kills, the rituals, the evolution of the kill room across different periods of Dexter's life, what the changes in his methods say about his psychological state at various points. We didn't spend much time on the supporting New York cast who are returning. Blessing Kamara, who as Dexter's landlord and friend in Season 2 remains the closest thing the show has to an innocent bystander in the middle of everything, and Detective Oliva, Wallace's partner, who was quietly suspicious of Harrison throughout Season 1 and who will presumably continue to be a low-level threat that the show uses to maintain investigative pressure in the background. We could also spend a whole evening on the question of what Dexter's relationship to his Miami history looks like now that Batista is dead. Batista was the last living person in his life who remembered the original version of Dexter Morgan, forensic analyst, team player, the man who brought donuts and smiled and was extremely good at his job while being something else entirely underneath. With Batista gone, the Miami chapter is truly over. The show can no longer trade on legacy in the same way. Whatever Dexter is now, he has to justify it through what he does in New York, not through what he was in Miami. That's actually quite a freeing creative position, even if it came at a significant cost. But sitting with what Season 2 seems to be shaping into, the Charlie situation, the two-killer structure, Quinn finally coming north, Harrison's 4-year evolution, the time jump, Mia's return in whatever form it takes. I find myself genuinely curious in a way I wasn't entirely expecting to be. Not cautiously optimistic the way you approach a franchise revival that's proved itself once and might not prove itself again. Just curious, interested, wanting to see where the pieces land. The Charlie thread is the one I'm most invested in, personally, not because romance in a crime drama is inherently interesting, but because the specific situation, two people who know everything about each other choosing to be in proximity, is the first time this show has built a potential relationship on total honesty from the very beginning, which is a strange thing to say about a show about a serial killer, and yet here we are. The thing about Dexter as a character, and I've thought about this quite a lot across many evenings of rewatching and thinking and rewatching again, is that he's inexhaustible in a way that most anti-heroes aren't. Walter White works because of his specific arc. His trajectory from where he starts to where he ends has a definitive shape. And once that shape is complete, the character is complete. Tony Soprano is bounded by his particular world, his particular circumstances, his particular era. Dexter doesn't work that way. The tension at the center of his story, the man who cannot be what society asks of him, but who genuinely wants the things that ordinary life offers, is not a tension that resolves. It's a condition. It persists. And as long as it persists, there are stories to tell about it, because each new set of circumstances reveals a different facet of what that condition actually is. That's why the conversation is still alive. 20 years after it began, and people are still here, still finding things to notice and argue about and look forward to. You don't do that for something you've decided is over. You do it for something that keeps mattering. And there's something to be said about the specific pleasure of the theorizing itself, of sitting with a show you know well and thinking about what it might do next. Not with anxiety, but with the relaxed curiosity of someone who trusts the subject enough to wonder about it freely. That's what tonight has been, really. Not analysis with stakes, just company. The kind you have with something you spent a lot of time with, and that has, in return, given you a lot to think about. Season 2 of Dexter. Resurrection will answer most of these questions eventually, some of them better than we're imagining, some differently, some in ways neither of us has considered tonight. That's the best possible outcome. The theories that land are the ones that tell you something true about the story you were theorizing about. The ones that don't land are just as interesting in their own way, because understanding why a show made a different choice than the one you expected is its own kind of insight. I'm looking forward to seeing how it falls wherever you are tonight. I hope this was a comfortable couple of hours. Season 2 is targeting a fall 2026 premiere. Early October looks like the most likely window based on the production schedule. And I'll be covering it in depth when it arrives, episode by episode, or at least the big moments. In the meantime, there are a few other Dexter videos I've been wanting to do. A proper walk through the full franchise timeline, a look at the kill room as a narrative device and what it tells us about Dexter's psychology across different periods of his life, and possibly something on the code's internal logic and the ways it bends and holds and occasionally breaks across 20 years of story. But those are for other evenings. Tonight, the dark passenger can rest.